All right, happy noon. My name is Nina Ignazik. I am the founder and editor of Planet Detroit. And thank you so much for joining us today for this interesting discussion we're going to have about 500,000 acres of wetlands in Metro Detroit. Thank you so much for joining us. We are joined today by a panel of experts that will dissect a pretty big goal that our regional planning agency, SEMCOG, Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, has set by increasing our wetland coverage in the region to 500,000 acres over the next 25 years. To give you an idea of what that looks like, we have a chart that kind of describes where we are now. So the green is the current acreage of wetlands in Metro Detroit. And then this is how many more the SEMCOG goal is setting that we want to create or restore in the region. So that's not going to be an easy task, and we are going to talk about that. But first, I'd like to introduce our panelists and give them just about 30 seconds to express why they think this is an important thing to be talking about. So we will start with Chris Bunch, the executive director of the nonprofit Six Rivers Land Conservancy, and our partner on this webinar. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Nina, thanks so much for having us, and of course, thanks so much to Katie and Diane for giving their time, talent, and wisdom to this critical discussion. And I just, I would say that it's self-evident because those of us that work in the field have been immersed in this for so long. But a lot of folks don't, I guess, understand it. Wetlands are, sort of the kidneys of the system, right? They're critical to the health of the water quality that we enjoy, and they're critical to a whole lot of other things: flood storage, outdoor recreation, access to recreation, and wildlife habitat. They provide all sorts of endangered species habitat. And, I guess if you're ever out on a hike or out in the woods with me, you don't want to follow me because I'm the one who invariably goes into the wetland because that's where all the cool stuff is. So it's really important to preserve and restore and enhance those assets in this region, especially because, the SEMCOG region, the 7 counties, the metropolitan Detroit area that includes 7 counties, is the economic engine of the state and houses more than half of the state's population. Most of the state lives here and works here, and it's, it needs to be maintained as a beautiful and inviting and attractive area, as well as to support all of those residents that live here. And I would just finish by saying that, I'm one of the ones who believes that we have an obligation to the future to improve and steward and maintain what we have so that future generations inherit something that's fabulous like we have been given. So that's the thumbnail for me.
All right. Thank you, Chris. So next up, we will talk with Diane Martin. She is the Director of Ecological Services at ASTI Environmental. Diane, how do you see this issue in your work? Why is it so important? You've dedicated basically your entire career to this issue of wetlands.
Hi, Nina. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate being here and sharing kind of my experience of what we've seen over the last 30 years in the regulatory program in Michigan. I think it's really important that we are starting to look at this in a regional context because of the historical losses that the Metro Detroit area has already seen. Statistics are showing us that this region has already lost 77% of its wetlands. And so I feel because of these historic losses, we really need to carefully proceed with how we handle what we have remaining. And this puts us at a little bit of a divergence because we certainly want a strong economy. Strong economies can create revenue and opportunities for preservation projects, but we need to protect what we have left. So proceeding with our regulatory framework very carefully is important for helping Southeastern Michigan complete this goal. In my line of work, we deal with wetlands in a consulting fashion. So we are helping our clients navigate the regulatory framework in terms of first identifying what wetlands they have on their property, what the size of them are, and if they're regulated. Not all wetlands are regulated in Michigan, and we can go over that in a little bit. So we will help define the wetlands, determine whether they're regulated, help our clients get through the permitting process if that's necessary, if we determine it's a permittable project, and then help them with mitigation, which can be in the form of creation, restoration, banking, and in some cases, preservation. And we can talk about what that looks like in a bit as well. And then we are also helping communities enact their own local wetland regulations, which helps add an additional layer to protecting wetlands that are not already regulated by the state of Michigan.
All right, thank you so much, Diane. And lastly, but not least, we have Katie Grantham. Katie is an environmental planner with SEMCOG, Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. That is our regional governing organization of which local governments are members. And they put out a plan earlier this year, which was the inspiration for this webinar, and a pretty audacious goal of reaching 500,000 acres of wetlands in Metro Detroit by 2050. So Katie, thanks for being here. Why should people care about wetlands in Metro Detroit?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks so much for having me here today to be a part of this webinar. I've had the privilege of working with Diane and Chris over the years, and they're really excellent people to talk about wetlands with. So I think we'll have a great conversation today. Wetlands are a really important, but I think often overlooked ecosystem, especially in Southeast Michigan, where so much of this urbanization and development have happened. You really heard from Diane and Chris about how development has removed a lot of our historic wetlands, and overall that really impacts how water moves across our landscape, as well as kind of how it's stored and how water quality is impacted. So over the past few years, we've really felt the impacts of climate change within Southeast Michigan. We've seen a lot more frequent and intense storm events that our aging infrastructure system just isn't able to handle. And so a lot of areas of our region have experienced some pretty intense flooding. But wetlands can actually play a role in reducing the impacts of these events by acting as natural buffers and soaking up and storing a significant amount of floodwater. A wetland can typically store about 3 acre-feet of water or 1 million gallons. So they have a really large impact, and that's critical for our region. And beyond this, wetlands also act as natural filters for pollutants and sedimentation during these events. So they really help keep our rivers, lakes, and streams clean, which is critical because Southeast Michigan is really at the heart of the Great Lakes region. And so, emphasizing what Chris said earlier, it's important that we incorporate these systems back into our region so that we really are leaving it better for the next generation of people. So wetlands kind of serve as nature's stormwater engineers, and they're really important to our region. And that's what we wanted to emphasize in putting together this green initiative, which I'm going to be talking a lot about in a little bit. But really trying to, at SEMCOG, be a convener of people and serve as that planning organization to give local governments and communities the tools they need to make decisions about how to manage our wetlands, how to preserve them, how to restore them moving into the future. So thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks for being here. Okay, so we are going to get started with a little bit of a Wetlands 101 with Diane, and she's going to just give us a little bit of foundation for the discussion we're going to have, a little bit of a history lesson. So Diane, take it away with, what should we know about wetlands and wetland regulation as well?
So both Chris and Katie touched on what the importance of wetlands are. These are just a few of them. We could do a whole webinar alone on just the importance of wetlands and what they do for us. Everything from habitat. Wetlands are some of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. They provide spawning areas for fisheries. They provide opportunities for recreation, kayaking. If you've gone up to St. Clair, Lake St. Clair Metro Park, you can kayak right through the coastal wetland there. Wetlands along our lakes, whether inland lakes or our Great Lakes, help stabilize the shorelines. No, we don't always really need to have those hard armoring. The wetlands, if they were left in place, would do a very good job of protecting our shorelines naturally. Wetlands allow for groundwater recharge, recharging our drinking water systems, and then also slowly allowing water to flow back into the streams to maintain a base stream flow that's important for aquatic wildlife. If you drive around Metro Detroit after a big rain event, you'll see probably one of the main reasons why nature created wetlands, and that is that of reducing our flooding impact. So if you're driving and you're hitting a lot of water standing over the road, you're probably in an area that has lost most of its wetlands and therefore does not have land available to hold and absorb that water and slowly release it back into our drainage ways. And then also, just as important, our wetlands are really good at helping protect our water quality. A lot of really important chemical transformations occur in wetlands. Water from our lakes and streams, when they enter wetlands, the water slows down and drops its sediment load, and therefore pulls all that cloudiness out of the water and cleaning it as the water goes downstream. So we really need our wetlands for our healthy ecosystems. That said, not all wetlands in Michigan are protected. So our Michigan has what's called Section 404 authority, which means our federal government has allowed Michigan, only one of two states, to have our regulatory jurisdiction over wetlands in Michigan. So what that means is that when you are dealing with regulated wetlands in Michigan, you're going to be dealing with our State Department most of the time instead of the federal government and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And that really helps for a smooth permitting process. And we feel in Michigan that it makes for a very streamlined permitting process. And so unless you are dealing with one of the Great Lakes or the connecting waterways, you're going to be dealing with our state department called EGLE, which is the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And they will be issuing a permit if they determine that a project is permittable, and then overseeing what their mitigation requirements are. In some cases, as I alluded to earlier, our local municipalities have additional wetlands protection. Our state Wetland Act allows for this and allows for provisions for how these local municipalities can also regulate wetlands. And why that's important is because our state wetland statute regulates wetlands that are greater than 5 acres in size, or any size wetland that is connected to or within 500 feet of an inland lake, stream, or county drain. And so you can imagine that a 4.9 acre wetland that's further than 500 feet away from a stream that isn't protected could also still be a very regionally important wetland, and certainly important to all the critters that are living in it. And so it's those wetlands that the local municipalities now have the opportunity to protect through their own ordinances and provisions.
Got it. And so do very many municipalities opt for this? Do we have a lot of local wetlands protections ordinances?
I think most of the southeastern Michigan probably has more than most areas in the state that have their own local wetland protections. West Bloomfield's very strong. We help Oakland Township with their wetland ordinances. Rochester Hills also has a very strong wetland protection ordinance. Putnam Township all the way in Livingston County has one. Orchard Lake Village has had one for quite a few years, and we help them administer theirs. So, certainly there could always be room for more, and this would definitely help with our goal. And we see a lot of good work coming out of our local wetland ordinances.
Okay, we've got a reader question asking us to repeat what qualifies a wetland for a regulation. I think it's not 500 acres, it's 5 acres. And what was the proximity?
Yep, so it's wetlands that are greater than 5 acres or greater in size, or wetlands that are of any size but connected to directly or within 500 feet of an inland lake, stream, or drain. And then there's also a couple other cases where wetlands are regulated. For example, if the wetland is known to contain a threatened or endangered species, or if it's a particular wetland type that's on the state's rare and imperiled wetland type list. Those wetlands are protected by the state. And then, as I said, local governments can also then protect smaller acreages of wetlands. And then, Michigan's a little bit complex in how the regulations work. But if it's a federally funded project, then almost all wetlands will be regulated in that case based on our EO 11990, which is a federal act that protects all wetlands with federal monies involved. So it's very complicated, but most wetlands are protected, but not all. And I think that's where we have some room for improvement from the local level.
Got it. Okay. So, Katie, tell us about this number, 500,000 acres. What does that mean? How did you settle on that number as a goal for the region?
Yeah, that's a great question. 500,000 is a big goal, and having a plan to get there is really important. So I really want to start by giving some context to what is this green initiative that we're referring to. So in 2022, SEMCOG began an initiative which we call GREEN, which stands for Growing Our Resilience, Equity, and Economy with Nature. And it really aims to increase the abundance and the quality of Southeast Michigan's green infrastructure network. So as part of this initiative, we brought together public and private partners, as well as experts from across the region, to really talk about how can we connect this system better, how can we improve our green infrastructure system, and more importantly, how do we work together to achieve these goals. And so from this initiative, we really tried to bring all these people together to say, how do we move into the future? What are these goals? And so today, we're really continuing to work with partners on how to practically do this work. But one of the things that came out of this is our strategic framework for green. And this really sets the stage for these goals, where we're trying to get to, and starts to develop that path for how we get there. So kind of coming back around to that 500,000 acre goal. What we started with is really looking at the data that we had from our region to benchmark our current wetland acreage and network. And that really came from a 2015 National Wetland Inventory update that Ducks Unlimited and the state of Michigan helped do for us in partnership with us. And so once we really had, where are we at today and how does that compare to historic wetlands and the loss that we've experienced, we started to meet and discuss this goal with experts like watershed councils, stormwater practitioners, wetland consultants like Diane, and conservation organizations like Chris, to really get a sense of what is the work they're doing, how can we support their work by setting a goal. And we also looked at what communities were doing across the state, as well as what the state of Michigan is doing, and even started to venture out into what are we seeing in terms of what's happening across the country, so that we can really kind of be a leader in this, and also really tie into some of the other work that's happening all over to protect wetlands. And so what we kind of determined is that the state of Michigan has a goal for restoring 10% of historic wetlands. And so after a lot of consultation with these groups, we really felt it was a good goal for our region as well. So for Southeast Michigan, we're really hoping we can work together to restore and preserve wetlands so that we have a total of 500,000 acres of wetlands within our region. And that's really helping the state of Michigan to achieve their 10% historic wetland restoration goal.
Okay, so this number aligns with the state's goal, essentially.
It does. Mm-hmm.
Got it. Okay. So we know that this is going to require kind of two tactics, right? Preserving wetlands that already exist, even if they're less than 5 acres, and then restoring areas that maybe were once wetlands, but are no longer, that could be wetlands again, right? So Chris, let's transition and talk about the preservation side of this. So you work for a land conservancy. You're the executive director of a land conservancy. What does that mean, and what does it mean in terms of wetland preservation? What does a land conservancy do?
Well, yeah. So first and foremost, Land Conservancy works with private landowners and public partners to conserve land, and we do that with private landowners who share our commitment to conservation, who think it's important to leave high quality natural resources in place, and choose to do that with their land. So they either do that through donating a conservation easement or donating their land for a preserve. There are some programs that provide funding on occasion for buying conservation easements and buying preserves, but as with anything in life, raising the money is much harder than people would think it is. And then we also work with public agency partners to acquire lands for them that they want to turn into nature preserves and parks. So we've done some where we go in and buy a piece of property and hold it while our public agency partner raises the money to then cash us out and make it a nature preserve. So an example of one of those right now is our Turtle Woods project in Troy, where we actually have a large 70-acre parcel under purchase contract. And then we literally about 2 weeks ago closed on the purchase of an adjoining parcel, which will actually become the entry site and access point for that property. And our partners in this are Oakland County Parks, who have a purchase agreement with us to buy the property out from us. They have a grant application into the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund. Assuming that that's successful and the funds are awarded, they will cash us out on both properties. And that will become Turtle Woods, which will be the first Oakland County nature preserve in that part of the county. And the reason that this is so important is that it is a 70-acre forested wetland complex. Chunks of it are upland. Chunks of it are developable. I think about 40 acres of it are wetland, give or take. Diane will correct me because she knows this project intimately because she's been on it for years, but it has mature forests that are in the wetlands. It has other types of wetlands on the property. It has some remnant prairie in it. We call it Turtle Woods because the spotted turtle was on the property at some point and may still be there, and that is a threatened species in Michigan. And it feeds ultimately the Clinton River, which ultimately feeds Lake St. Clair. There are 6,000 glowing red bells that tell you that this property is an absolute critical priority for preservation. But because of where it's located, it is also a target for development. And we have been working on trying to preserve this property literally for decades in the face of people also trying to develop it. And finally, I think with our partners at Oakland County Parks, we have created the momentum and the resources to get it protected. This is, a critical example of something that needs to be done, and it just needs to be scaled up. If we're protecting 70 acres here and we've only got 137,000 more to go, then chop, chop, people, let's get cracking.
So what kind of opportunities do you see for preserving more? What kinds of projects are potentially in the pipeline?
Well, I think there's a whole range of sources that provide us opportunities. First and foremost, we're doing a lot of outreach to landowners that have properties with wetlands on them and letting them know about opportunities to protect them. There are mitigation projects that go on out there. A development has no choice but to impact a wetland, and therefore they have to mitigate. They have to create or restore or protect or some combination thereof. And that gives us a platform to leverage some financial resources to expand the scope of wetland. But there are just lots of opportunities out there that folks just aren't looking at. We're trying to do a project on the Rouge River that has two branches of the Rouge River that come together. It's about 40 acres of wetland, floodplain, and a little bit of upland. The upland is developable, but the most important part in all of this to me is that not only will it protect important segment of the Rouge River and important habitat, but the engineering numbers are that preserving it as it is right now prevents 2.5 million gallons of stormwater from entering the stormwater system in an average rainfall. With, and I'm going to be a little flippant here, with a lousy little $1 million of investment. With just a little bit of recontouring in this property, we can take 4 million gallons of flood water out of the system forever, or until all the glaciers melt and the state goes under the sea. So that natural solution in a highly urbanized part of this region is hugely inexpensive. that is a big, hairy deal to all the people that live downstream from that and whose basements flood every time. If this property is developed as it is allowed under existing zoning, we are just adding to the problem. We are exacerbating the problem. Here we have an opportunity to do something that's pretty inexpensive and uses what we've already got at hand.
And so where is this project?
That one is actually literally on the border of Detroit. It is Telegraph and 8 Mile.
Okay. And so the downstream people impacted would be in Detroit, but in the project is in Southfield, or?
The downstream people are in Detroit, literally. Yeah. I mean, this is the Rouge at the northwest corner of the city of Detroit. And as you go further downstream, lots more of Detroit. And of course, it's still fairly upland in the Rouge, but as you get further downstream, the Rouge gets much more developed. And we have projects like that. I mean, we have another big one we're doing over in Chesterfield Township that has significant benefit for people between the property, which is north of Selfridge Air National Guard Base, and Lake St. Clair. And again, all of these, we've got a huge one in New Baltimore, Anchor Bay Woods, the largest forested wetland complex of its type. Diane rang all the bells for that, right? It's critical to spawning habitat for the fishery in Lake St. Clair. It's critical to water quality in Lake St. Clair. I know this is going to come up later, but what's one of the obstacles we have? We couldn't get coastal zone funding for this property because M29 is considered to be the boundary between coastal wetlands and non-coastal wetlands. And guess what M29 is? It's a highway. And what was it? Built by people. And how far is this wetland from Lake St. Clair? Literally less than a quarter of a mile. So we have,
this coastal zone funding, for those who don't know, that is federal funding or state funding?
Yeah, that's federal funding that went into the big project that Diane did at Lake St. Clair Metro Park, I think. Or some variation of that.
Right. So policy and regulation play an important role in this. What are talk a little bit more about some of these kind of like policy issues that could change, and we're going to transition to Diane too to comment on these. What are some of the policy opportunities that you see?
Diane, that's you.
Yep, I can address that.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so in some cases, mitigation is allowed to come about in the form of preservation of existing wetlands. And so what we've worked on in the past, well, actually about 30 years, is finding these gems of wetland left that have opportunity for preservation as mitigation. It's allowed under our regulatory framework in certain cases where the existing wetland is high quality, high functioning, but also under some sort of threat. It can be a threat of development, it can be threat from invasive species. And preservation as mitigation is done at a 10-to-1 ratio, where let's just say you have been allowed 1 acre of wetland impact. You then have to preserve 10 acres. So it's a 10-to-1 ratio, preserving 10 acres of existing wetland. And so that can go a long way into helping us achieve our goal in southeastern Michigan. And there have been, organizations, parks and recs, county departments that have identified remaining wetlands. In some cases, they've assigned quality ratings to them. So I think we have a good grasp. Eagle knows of them. Chris knows of them. In some cases, we as consultants come across these gems of wetlands as we are doing our work. And it would be great if there was a database of these that we, could then go through every time we have a mitigation project to see if these wetlands would be considered as mitigation by Eagle as we go through the regulatory process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. We have a policy question. I'm just going to let it jump in here now since we're on this topic. We've had a few questions before this and now about the Supreme Court ruling on Chevron, which impacts perhaps may impact a state's ability to regulate wetlands. What do you think this is going to have in terms of impact?
So from my perspective, because the state of Michigan has Section 404 authority and we are only one of 2 states that is allowed to operate our own program. We are somewhat removed from what happens at the federal level. As we've been watching in the past few years, the federal wetlands protections are being stripped. And so this impacts a lot of the other states, but thankfully Michigan's framework stays strong and is still allowed to operate separate from the federal program.
Okay, got it. All right.
Nina, if I can, and I want to add to what Diane said here. It's really important for people to understand. I worked in Ohio for a number of years. Michigan is one of only 2 states that has full authority to regulate its wetlands, and that is hugely beneficial to us. We have a lot more influence over what happens to our wetlands, and it's also beneficial to the development community, because they understand that it's much easier to work with local people who understand what's going on the ground than it is to work through the federal system. So one of the things that we need to be both grateful for and strongly preserve is our ability to control the wetland regulation environment in which we work, because otherwise it starts to go out of our hands, and we have a lot less influence over the outcomes, both good and bad.
Okay.
That's correct. A few years ago, the EPA, who oversees our Section 404, the 404 authority, was reviewing it, and there was some risk that we were going to lose our ability to regulate our own wetlands. And it was pretty much unanimous. Everybody went to Lansing to bang on the doors and say, no, we need to keep our Section 404 authority. We need to keep our own wetlands program. It operates better than most states. And, this was consultants, this was developers, this was municipalities. It was pretty unanimous in terms of support for our State Department and our state wetland statute.
Got it. So Diane, you've been doing this for a few years. We're going to use the word decades as a wetlands consultant. What are the main issues that come up regulatory and for wetlands advocates? What are some of the pathways you see towards trying to preserve and restore wetlands?
Yeah, from our, a lot of our clients have a hard time navigating the regulatory framework. It is difficult just because of the different layers and the way wetlands are regulated in Michigan. So we help them, navigate that process in terms of identifying what wetlands are regulated, whether or not they have a permittable project, and then, helping them through that permitting process if we deem it a permittable project, and we feel Eagle will as well, and then helping them through the mitigation process. But it's time consuming and somewhat expensive. And so, we routinely advise our clients to avoid wetlands if at all possible, because the state mandates it. And so it is not easy to impact a regulated wetland in the state of Michigan. There is good regulatory authority over that wetland if it's protected. On the flip side, wetland advocates probably think that too many wetlands are impacted and that it's not protective enough. And so we see the other side as well. And certainly they get frustrated by the fact that, not every wetland is going to be protected, and that, wetlands that may be important to them are allowed to be impacted in some cases where there's no other feasible or prudent alternative.
Got it. Okay. We are more than halfway through. We have a lot of questions, but we're just going to wrap up a little bit talking about restoration. Diane, what does that mean? What does it mean to restore a wetland? What does a restored wetland look like? And how successful are these kinds of restorations?
So restoration typically is returning an area that was formerly wetland historically back into a functioning wetland system. So typically these areas have been dredged or filled or drained and no longer function as a wetland. And so restoration can look like a couple different things, both from a voluntary restoration perspective and then also from a regulatory perspective. Volunteer wetland restoration is being accomplished throughout our southeastern Michigan area by conservation organizations such as Ducks Unlimited. They're probably one of the biggest in terms of just finding wetlands to restore them just for the sake of wetland restoration, of course, for producing ducks as well. But they have a tremendous amount of funding. But there's many conservation organizations out there that are looking for projects and finding projects just to restore habitat, including wetlands. From a regulatory perspective, wetland restoration comes in the form of mitigation. And so this, again, is finding areas that were historically wetland that can be turned back into wetland from either removing the fill material or in some cases just breaking the drain tile that's draining the wetland. And so this can be done as part of a mitigation program. So mitigation is when wetland impacts are allowed under our state system. They have to be mitigated for at a ratio of typically 1.5 to 1 for some wetland systems, and then for forested wetland systems, the mitigation ratio is 2 to 1. So typically mitigation wetlands are getting accomplished at a higher rate than the impacts are occurring. And so that mitigation ratio can help us achieve our goal of increasing protected and restored wetlands in southeastern Michigan.
Okay, so could you repeat that part, the ratios parts again, so people can understand what does that mean, 10 to 1 or 2 to 1?
Yep. So typically wetlands are categorized by what type of wetland they are. So emergent wetlands have herbaceous materials being dominant. Scrub shrub wetlands have shrub materials being dominant. And then forested wetlands, of course, are dominated by trees. Mm-hmm. And so if the state determines that a wetland permit can be issued, mitigation is required for those impacts. And the mitigation has to be accomplished at a higher rate than what was impacted. So for emergent and scrub shrub wetlands, the mitigation ratio is 1.5 to 1. Meaning you have to create 1.5 times the amount of wetland that was impacted. For forested wetlands, because they're typically higher quality and and take longer to create and develop, the mitigation ratio is increased to 2 to 1, meaning you have to create or restore 2 times the amount of wetland that was impacted in your permit.
Okay, and we're going to talk about what all this costs, I think, in the questions, because we got a few questions related to that. But, oh, sorry, did you have more?
I did, because the last slide was talking about a project that was within an area of concern, which a lot of our wetland protections and wetland restorations that are occurring in southeastern Michigan are coming about through our wonderful AOC area of concern programs that are being funded by funding initiatives such as the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, GLRI money. You probably have heard about GLRI money really coming into Michigan along our Great Lakes. We have 5 areas of concern here in southeastern Michigan. The Detroit River, Rouge River, Clinton River, St. Clair River, and Raisin River all have areas of concern, which means they receive special consideration and have to have certain goals that they achieve so they can get delisted as an area of concern. And so as an AOC, you are able to draw and receive special pots of money from the federal government to achieve these goals. So if you go into the Great Lakes AOC website, you can see all the different wetland restoration activities and projects that are going on in the SEMCOG region that all will help us achieve our goal here for our green initiative.
Okay, trying to come up with that website to put a chat there. I'll put it in the chat when we find it. And we will, by the way, follow up with some resources and links and things mentioned during this session, as well as a recording of the session. Chris, what does it mean for a land conservancy when you're trying to be part of a wetland restoration? What are some of the roadblocks that you encounter?
Well, of course, always the first and foremost is the acquisition cost, right? That's foundational to everything. What's it cost to get the property just to start with? And certainly Diane would speak to that from the mitigation bank side, what it costs to acquire the property. I think you asked that a little bit earlier. So, first and foremost is the acquisition cost. And then secondly is what funds the actual restoration, and then the long-term monitoring and maintenance, right? So you can't just bust up a couple of tiles in an old farm field and walk away and say, oh, yay, there's a wetland. What happens is that you get a lot of invasive species and a lot of other things that significantly impair or, reduce any kind of functionality that you would get out of it. So you really need to do these things thoughtfully. I would also argue expeditiously. We need to be moving quickly. We need to invest in the restoration piece and the expansion piece so that we can start to offset some of the impacts that we talked about earlier in this. I think the other challenge that you run up against sometimes is public sentiment, right? There are constituencies that would rather see property stay in a different state or turned into something different than be sustained as or created as a wetland. And that's largely because people, we talked about it in the beginning again, there's not a significant sense of value for what our wetlands do or why they're important to have. So, I would say funding and timing are the two biggest issues. Landowners, we function in the marketplace. Landowners need to sell their property when they need to sell their property. When I come to them and say, this is wonderful, we'd love to protect it, by the way, it's going to take us 2.5 years to raise the money, they're like, yeah, never mind, a for sale sign is going up. And sometimes, we encounter the opposite of that. Somebody's been trying to sell a piece of property for 10 years. It's got wetlands on it. Diane's convinced people not to buy it because they're not going to be able to build on it, but they still have this vision that, someday it's going to be a little Venice or it's going to be a shopping mall. And so coming to a meaningful agreement on price is always a challenge.
Got it. It's all about the money. Okay, so Katie, tell me about what's next for this and how do you track progress? How do you know, how are we going to know if we're making progress towards this 500,000 or 1,000 acre goal and when we get there?
Yeah, that's a great question. How are we tracking progress and how are we starting to reach this goal? So I'll kind of start with tracking progress. That's really something that we're figuring out how to do right now. There are so many different municipalities, watershed councils, organizations across our region that are doing projects. And so what we've really set up is that we have our green implementation team as kind of an extension of this project, where we're really continuing to try and bring those partners together on a quarterly basis to get updates from them about what projects are moving forward. Really hear about the challenges like, Chris talked about, like where are some of those barriers and how can SEMCOG play a role in starting to remove some of those barriers so that we can do this work a little bit more. And then also figuring out like where we want to go. So I will say that one of the things that we're really excited about is that SEMCOG did receive money from the Herb Family Foundation to expand our green efforts by really doing a regional analysis to figure out where are some of these areas where we can do some pretty large scale green infrastructure implementation, and where are some of the areas that we should be preserving our land and preserving these wetlands. I think sometimes all of these municipalities and communities have so much going on that, like Chris said, it's important to be intentional, but sometimes we're just jumping at pots of funding or, trying to move something forward as quickly as possible. And so really what SEMCOG's role is to be an organization that convenes these people, that collects that data, and starts to provide people with the tools to understand where these areas are and how they can move forward. So what we're going to be working on, the first kind of step of this is working with Ducks Unlimited to really get a more updated inventory of our wetlands today, and then kind of doing this landscape conservation assessment to figure out where we can expand and enhance wetlands and where are some of those critical areas for protection, and helping local governments to really prioritize these projects moving forward so that as, funding becomes available, they know about a project. One of the cool things we're doing as part of this, as well as another project that we have, is trying to provide things like concept plans. So, sometimes a local government might have an idea for what a project could look like or what they're interested in doing there. But to be competitive for funding, you need to be a little bit further down the road, and that takes time and money. And so SEMCOG's kind of stepping in and working with some of our local partners and organizations like the Center for Watershed Protection to develop a concept for that site, really get a sense of how much it's going to cost to do that project, what are the environmental benefits of doing that project, so that as funding comes available, that can move forward and be more competitive, especially at a federal level. So that's kind of what we'll be working on over the next year, and really collecting that data and starting to disseminate that information and figuring out where are these priority areas that we can start to target now, both for conservation as well as for implementing some of these large-scale green infrastructure projects that are truthfully going to make a huge difference in terms of flood storage capacity within our region. Chris brought it up earlier, but I think one of the things that we forget about is that flooding is really impacting people downstream. And so it's really important for us to, build our green infrastructure network there, but it's also important to think about the upstream piece of it and holding water back so that it doesn't, go into that system and flood people's basements. So that's, really something that we'll be thinking about with this analysis moving forward. And we'll continue to convene all of these partners to make sure that the data that we're collecting and the projects that we're implementing are realistic and tangible for the future.
And go ahead.
Nina, let me just pick up on something that both Diane and Katie said for just half a second, and that is that the other barrier, the other big challenge I think that we're facing in this region is that we ultimately need a paradigm shift at the top and at the bottom. So we have competing interests that are fighting each other. We talked a little bit about this the other day. I'm just going to pick on one example, right? We know that that Johnson Creek in the Rouge River watershed is the last cold water tributary remaining of Johnson Creek, and is a very high quality asset, right? Friends of the Rouge just found red-sided dace there, which is a threatened species, right? It also so happens that 600 or 700 acres along Johnson Creek is slated for economic development. It's identified as an opportunity for industry, for whatever it is, a battery plant, a shopping mall, a widget factory, a school. I mean, some massive gray infrastructure. So there are two places where we've got competing public policy and competing interests. And I would argue, I think all of us would argue, that the natural resource issues are becoming superior to the building issues, right? The built environment. We've got lots and lots of built environment, and we're paying huge costs, billions of dollars for flooding, for water quality, and so on and so forth. So I just really think there needs to be a paradigm shift that allows us to start to think a little bit differently about the value of these things and refocus and retarget some of our efforts and resources.
Yeah, and Chris, you bring up such a good point. I think it's important for us to continue working with people like developers to say, all right, if you're going to develop this area, then you need to provide some mitigation, some best management practices, either at that site or somewhere else, so that as they're including more impervious cover and putting that into our network, we're also starting to get some mitigation from doing that. And so that might look like some small grade infrastructure implementation in a parking lot, or it could even start to expand into things like stormwater or wetland crediting, where they're really contributing to the larger system as a whole.
So I'm gonna thank you for all of that. I'm gonna move us to the questions, but I'm gonna follow kind of that last piece with one of the questions, which is, so we have mitigations policies in Michigan. How effective are they? Aren't we getting those mitigation values now when developers come in and build widget factories, or not? And how effective is it when we get a restored wetland?
Yeah, we have a strong mitigation component to our regulatory framework. Mitigation is almost always required for projects that are permitted. And I would say within the last 10 years, we have switched from doing more on-site mitigation to going to a program called wetland mitigation banking. And wetland mitigation banking is where large wetlands, 10 acres in size or greater, are built ahead of the impacts. And they can either be owned privately or publicly. And so the wetlands are built, Eagle maintains the program and releases wetland credits as the wetlands develop and become functional. And then the applicants that are getting the wetland permits have to pay for credits from the Wetland Mitigation Bank as their mitigation. And what this program has allowed the state to do is have a bigger wetlands to have built, and so we have bigger wetlands that are functioning at a greater capacity. It takes some of the pressure off of Eagle to make sure that every small wetland mitigation that was previously done on site actually gets built, is built correctly, is maintained and monitored. And so it takes some of the pressure off of them for all these small permits that are out there. All the permits, all the impacts can be mitigated at these large mitigation bank sites that are monitored separately. And so that's where probably the biggest shift in our mitigation program has gone to in the last 10 years, is from seeing small, tiny pocket wetlands built on site as mitigation to having people buy into this wetland mitigation banking program for bigger wetlands that are done on more of a regional scale.
So the banking is actually a form of preservation then?
Creation or what we would call restoration. So most of our mitigation banks are in areas that were wetland that had been dredged, filled, drained, and are now returned to wetland.
Okay. We have a few questions about kind of referencing the ideas that these created wetlands just don't perform like natural wetlands, and they're just much less efficacious. Can we address that? What do we know about how well these perform?
Yeah, I think that early on in my career, when wetland mitigation was, in its infancy, I would say there was definitely a component of wetland mitigation that just was not working, that the wetlands that were created were either, too wet and acting as, ponds, or too dry and not really functioning as wetlands at all. But I think that today, and obviously with the wetland mitigation banking program being so strong and being so regulated, the wetland credits are only released once the wetlands have met a very strict standard of performance, not only for how they look in terms of, the amount of vegetation within them, but how they're functioning. And they really have to function to a higher level before those credits are offered on the market as mitigation. So I think our program has really come a long way in the 30 years that I've been in it. And Eagle does a great job, I think, watching the program and making sure that mitigation is accomplished. And there's all sorts of checks and balances now to ensure that mitigation occurs and functions as a component of the permit that was issued.
Okay, got it. All right. We touched on this earlier, and Planet Detroit reported on a wetland mitigation or a wetland permit that was issued that ASTI worked on. So I understand if you can't comment on it directly, but we do see important wetlands that people care about destroyed. What are some of the issues with Eagle's permitting process that people want to understand or need to understand, and how can more of these wetlands, I guess, be conserved?
Nina, let me take a crack at that for just a second, if you will. And I'll answer the last one first, right? So we live in a state and a nation that is driven by property rights and capital values. So the way that we preserve them is that we acquire them. If we own them, then nothing can happen to them. The regulatory regime is pretty strong in Michigan, but it's still driven by underlying forms that say that all land is valued at its highest and best use, which is as developed. And this sort of gets back to that paradigm shift that I talked about earlier needing to happen. Until that happens, the way to get in front of the bus, the way to get in front of the bulldozer is to own it, which is part of the reason I've chosen to work for a land conservancy. I used to work in the advocacy field, but now I understand that if we own it, we control it. And so one of the biggest things we can do here is to invest in getting these things out of harm's way, to acquire them and own them and prevent even the possibility that they will be developed. And where that's not possible, then as Diane talks about, mitigation has evolved significantly. You know, we have a lot of little pockets of Phragmites throughout the region that were created wetlands. And so are those functioning as they were intended? Absolutely not. Are there the resources available ever to monitor and enforce and maintain these? Probably not. So doing things on a larger scale, as Diane was talking about, makes a lot of sense. But first and foremost, you know, the regulatory regime is built on no net loss of wetlands. But it is also built on a system that says that the highest and best use of a property is as developed. So there's a little conflict there. And the tools that we have available to us, I think you said it earlier, Nina, it's all about the money, right? We ultimately need to do what we can to get them out of harm's way. So we'll keep doing that to the best we can. And Katie will keep helping out with pointing us where we should be doing that. And Diane will continue to do what she does, trying to ensure that the outcome is the best when we have no other choice.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that a little bit in that, you know, in our role with wetland permitting, I'm going to speak for Eagle a little bit just because we work so closely with them, that wetland impacts are not taken lightly by anyone, certainly not by wetland ecologists, not by Eagle, but they are faced with operating our state wetland program. And part of that is to look at the public need for the project that's proposed. And they do a very good job evaluating that public need and reducing the wetland impacts to the greatest extent possible. And you know, getting the program, getting the project to something that is palatable from a state permitting perspective. And of course, they can only operate to the extent that the state statute allows them to. So wetland impacts will always occur. We need roads, we need landfills to expand until we have figured out a way to recycle all of our garbage. We all send garbage to landfills. We all drive on roads. We all have, you know, friends living in subdivisions. Wetland impacts will happen. I think Eagle is doing a great job reducing those to the greatest extent possible. And when they can't be prevented, then our strong mitigation banking program, preservation as mitigation, those are then our opportunities to make up for those impacts and to still get us more wetlands in the end than we are impacting.
All right, I am going to ask one more audience question, and then we'll be wrapping up because we are almost at the hour. We had a couple questions about can wetlands be restored in urban areas? One commenter mentioned neighborhoods in Detroit, Springwells, Warrendale, Jefferson, Chalmers, Brightmoors are all former wetlands. It seems like there could be wetland restoration there. What are some of the issues with restoring wetlands in urban environments versus rural environments? And I know it's probably a long discussion, but I'll ask for some concise responses as we get towards the end of our call.
So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Certainly these are the areas that really need the wetlands for all sorts of reasons, even just recreational and passive recreation opportunities. Certainly part of the problem is, you know, finding areas that are available, that are for sale, that sometimes the cost is prohibitive. Sometimes there's already buildings on it. There may be contamination issues that have to be faced when trying to recreate wetlands in these areas. But it's happening. Marathon Oil is creating pocket wetlands along one of the Rouge Oxbows. And this will we're already seeing, you know, tremendous amounts of wildlife coming back to that area. So it's a great opportunity, in my opinion, and can be even done as part of mitigation.
Yeah, I think Diane's right on the money. You know, there are three big deals. One is the money. How much is it actually going to cost to acquire these properties? Secondly, certainly a lot of contamination issues, as we know, in the historically developed areas that are more urbanized. And the third, quite frankly, is the people, right? So you've got people living in that vicinity, and you may need properties that actually have houses that people are living in on them as part of this restoration. So you're going to have to start thinking about what it means to get these folks to go to different places to live. Whether it's moving next door or down the block. And I mean, I drive over the top of my grandparents' home on a regular basis. They used to live where the interchange of I-75 and 696 is. I used to go to that as a little kid, and then I went and visited them in Royal Oak. So there's probably going to have to be some relocation thought if we're actually going to do this meaningfully in urbanized environments.
Anybody else have anything to add to that? All right. Well, we are at 1 o'clock. We have so many more audience questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to them all, but if anybody would like to follow up with me, we report on these issues regularly. Perhaps there's a future story we could work on, particularly with some of the future regulatory issues. So please feel free to mention or to hit me up with an email, nina@planetdetroit.org. But I am going to thank our panelists today so much for your time and your sharing your expertise. Thank you to Katie Grantham at SEMCOG, Chris Bunch at Six Rivers Regional Land Conservancy, and Diane Martin with ASTI Environmental. We really appreciate your time, and thank you for joining another Planet Detroit Live. We will see you next time.